Imagine you're responsible for feeding hundreds of household knights and nobles in a massive medieval castle with no refrigerators, no freezers, not even an ice chest, yet somehow these stone structures manage to keep food fresh for months, even years. Sounds impossible, right? But for centuries, castle kitchens mastered the art of food preservation. They used incredibly sophisticated methods, enough to store food to feed over 1,000 people for half a year. How did they do it? Let's start at the deepest part beneath the castle, the natural underground cold cellars. The medieval castle builders were truly ingenious. They dug deep underground and discovered a miracle down there. The temperature remained consistently around 13 degrees Celsius, or about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, all year round, and the deeper they dug, the cooler the air became. Thus the stone cellars were born a highly effective natural refrigerator. But don't think they were just dark rooms to pile food in. No, they were an entire labyrinth designed with great purpose. Food was distributed by depth. The deepest level, where temperatures that could drop below 10 degrees Celsius, was used for preserving milk, cheese, and fresh meat. A bit higher up was the area for wine, and keeping wine good was sometimes even more prioritized than keeping meat from spoiling. The top level was for hardier items than salted or dry produce. These labyrinthine cellars were so vast that cooks could get lost. Some castles even recorded instances where servants had to use chalk to mark their way so they wouldn't get lost, like a real-life Hansel and Gretel. There was a servant boy in one castle who went missing for 2 days. He was later found asleep next to a wine barrel. His excuse was that he got lost and the wine helped him stay warm. Interestingly, he still kept his job afterwards. However, these cellars weren't always perfect. Rats were a constant foe. Records show that the entire winter cheese supply was gnawed clean by rats. And even worse was flooding. Nothing was worse than waking up one morning to find your turnip cellar had turned into a miniature swimming pool. So, the castle cooks needed more than just a stone cellar, and that's why salt became the most powerful food preservation weapon. In medieval Europe, salt was white gold. Ever heard the phrases worth one's salt or salary? These two phrases originated from a time when salt was truly as precious as gold. An average castle used up to 5,000 pounds of salt each year just for food preservation, enough to fill a small room. Large castles were so big they even had a dedicated position called the saltmaster, who knew exactly which type of salt to use with which food. Fine white salt was used for milk and soft meats, while the coarse grain type was suitable for fish and hard meats. The principle was quite simple. Salt drew out water from food and free from bacteria. Without water, bacteria cannot survive, so the food wouldn't spoil. Salt back then was so precious that it became a trade commodity, highly profitable. A pound of good salt could be exchanged for a whole sheep. Salt merchants were so rich that they owned entire fleets. Of course, this also led to various frauds, such as mixing white stone powder to make fake salt. Not just for consumption, salt was also used as a headache remedy. Try eating salted fish, see if your stomach aches sometimes. A few slices of pickled lemon would work. It sounds a bit odd, but given the level of medicine back then, these were the mildest prescriptions. However, not every type of food was suitable for salting, and for meat and fish, sometimes people chose another method. Smoking. The smokehouse, a medieval BBQ workshop. Medieval smokehouses in castles were like early BBQ joints. The only difference was no paper towels, and no one argued about sauce recipes. These smokehouses were located outside the castle, both to avoid fire hazards and to be close enough for control. During peak season, they could process up to 200 pounds of meat daily. A castle with one residence needed about 18,000 pounds of smoked meat to survive the winter. Therefore, the smokehouse always had guards on duty. No one wanted to lose an entire winter's supply because someone snuck in and stole smoked meat. The wood used for smoking was also carefully selected. Oak wood was the slow-burning star, producing even smoke and a rich flavor. It could preserve meat for up to 4 months. Apple wood was reserved for special occasions, used for smoking pork, forest or venison. At these lavish feasts, fish was smoked with alder wood, creating the mild smoky flavor we still love to this day. Today, smoking is an art, with a dedicated smokemaster responsible for overseeing every step. Late autumn was the most stressful time. Sometimes 3 or 4 smokehouses had to run simultaneously, operating day and night, with meat hanging in the smoke for weeks. A single ham could take 3 months to fully cure. The interesting thing is that today's barbecue methods are not much different from the Middle Ages, except back then, no one posted brisket photos on social media. If salting and smoking were the 2 most powerful weapons for preserving meat and fish, then vegetables required an entirely different strategy, and that's when the art of pickling reigned supreme. Giant pickles and the pickle master. Medieval castles didn't just stop at pickling a few small jars of cucumbers. They did it on an industrial scale. Archaeologists have discovered giant pickling vats that could hold up to 100 gallons, or about 800 pounds of vegetables at a time. One such batch was enough to feed the entire castle for months. At Tau Castle records show they pickled 40 to 60% of their annual vegetable yield. Thanks to this, the castle garden was not just a place for viewing, but became a year-round vitamin C bank. And it wasn't just cucumbers or red onions. Medieval people pickled anything they could: cabbage, radishes, eggs, even beets, with beet juice creating a vibrant purple dish that delighted the children in the castle. Some castles even pickled lemons. Acute PC dun tu than, mo nun mao tim ruk ardi kind lontrok trong lao, gai thich tha ko lao gai con mui si chan, and imported oranges, luxuries reserved exclusively for the lord's household. An ancient cookbook even recounts how a baron was so outraged that he threatened to imprison his cook for daring to serve his special pickled plums to the soldiers as a treat. To pickle vegetables perfectly, castles even cultivated their own herb gardens for this purpose. These included garlic and mustard seeds, but the most important ingredient was still vinegar, the smelly yet crucial vinegar production facility. Medieval vinegar was not something when you bought at the market. Every large-scale castle produced its own vinegar, usually in a secluded corner, far from the main kitchen. Why? Because fermenting vinegar was quite pungent, but no matter how strong the smell, vinegar was an indispensable ingredient, so much so that large castles hired a dedicated specialist, the pickle master. Like a director of pickling operations, this person would carefully record each batch of pickles, ingredients, time, and vinegar concentration. Some of their notebooks still exist today, showing that their techniques were far from amateurish. They even knew tricks that modern people still use, like adding grape leaves to pickling jars to keep vegetables crisp. Who would have thought that your grandmother's pickling skills originated in the Middle Ages? Honey, the miracle natural preservative. But there's another secret, used for both preservation and healing, and incredibly sweet. That's honey. Castle residents understood the miraculous preservative power of honey very well. It doesn't spoil, doesn't get moldy, and isn't susceptible to bacterial contamination, thanks to its high sugar content, acidity, and special enzymes secreted by bees. Modern archaeologists have even found honey that is still edible after thousands of years. Therefore, every castle had its own bee farm, usually about half a mile from the castle walls. This was not only to avoid bee stings but also to be near flower fields and orchards. A standard bee farm consisted of about 100 hives distributed in various locations. To diversify the honey source, beekeepers lived in small huts near the beehives, not inside the castle, but they were treated very well. They had their own share of beer, which was believed to help reduce the pain when stung by a bee. Sounds reasonable, right? In the castle's infirmary, honey was clearly categorized. Light honey harvested in spring was used to treat coughs and heal wounds. Dark honey harvested in autumn was used to preserve fruits and meat. There were even honey candies, specifically for patients. Fruits soaked in honey were used to soothe sore throats and for nourishment. In the kitchen, honey was used very creatively, dipping fresh fruits into hot honey to create a protective layer, wrapping vegetables in honey-soaked cloths, and even stuffing fish into honey jars to transport them over long distances. An ancient cookbook even described how to preserve an entire goose with honey. It sounds funny, but it's entirely based on science. Honey that has such a high sugar content that bacteria cannot survive. Its natural acidity prevents mold, and it also contains natural antibacterial agents. It's no wonder that Beekeepers were valued no less than castle builders. Castle architecture, every stone has a reason. Speaking of builders, we cannot overlook a crucial element in the medieval food preservation strategy. The castle's architecture itself, not just a place to live and defend. Every room, every corridor in the castle was designed to support food storage and preservation. From the grain store holding 20,000 pounds of grain to the tiny cheese cave with ideal humidity, everything was calculated meticulously. They even had their own formula to calculate storage area for every 100 people. Approximately 1,000 square meters of specialized food storage was needed. The pinnacle was the natural ventilation system, also known as ventilation by pressure differential. Sounds complicated, but simply put, they created natural cool airflow by building vertical ventilation shafts running from the basement up to the highest tower. When wind blew across the opening at the top, it created a suction effect, drawing cool air upwards. Some castles, like those in Wales, were so cool that servants even vied to go down there to escape the summer heat. What's more, they even integrated rodent control into the design, sloping walls difficult to climb, rat ledges, and even mixing insect-repelling herbs into the mortar. Some castles even built pathways for cats, silent, rat-hunting knights patrolling within the walls. The kitchen system operated like a miniature city. Early kitchens were just places to light fires and cook, but later they became a very clearly divided complex. The buttery for storing drinks, not butter as its name suggests. The pantry for bread, grains, and dry goods. The spicery for expensive spices. Each area had its own ventilation and humidity control. Some castles even had dedicated rooms for aging cheese with slanted shelves to drain the whey. However, not everyone liked it. A steward once complained that the cheese aging room near the Lord's bedroom smelled so strong that he couldn't sleep. However, no matter how clever the architecture was, if there were no people to operate it, everything would be useless. If you look at a medieval castle kitchen, you won't see a head chef stirring a pot of soup alone like in the movies. What you're seeing is a complex operating system, like running a miniature city, where dozens of people cooperate to preserve and distribute food for thousands of mouths, from the young scullion to the preservation master. The staffing structure in the kitchen was very clearly hierarchical. At the top was the master cook, a kind of executive director of the kitchen. Under him were about 50 staff members, including at least 15 specialists in food preservation and storage. They were the ones who kept the supply from spoiling or being wasted, and also the ones who decided whether winter meals would be filling enough. Food records from a castle note that the position of preservation master, or the specialized preservation chef, was paid the equivalent of 30 sheep a year, which was quite generous for someone whose job it was to prevent food from spoiling. The apprentices started very young, around 12 years old, but don't think they got into the kitchen right away. Not at all. For the first 2 years, they didn't touch any pots or pans. Instead, they were trained in preservation, learning to identify spoiled meat by smell. Their first day on the job was not pleasant at all, and how to rotate inventory, and most importantly, how to prevent nobles from eating all the winter stores by November. A diary from an apprentice wrote that he had to memorize over 200 storage rules before he was allowed to touch a turnip. Sounds like spy training. So, inventory and record keeping. Medieval Excel. How did they track thousands of pounds of food without spreadsheets or barcode scanners? With a combination of tally sticks, wooden sticks with notches and parchment records. Each type of food had its own way of being recorded. Wine was marked with chalk on barrels, grain was measured with standard scoops, and preserved meat had numbered tags. During excavations, dice were even found near the kitchen, perhaps for playing games during breaks, and even recipes carved into the kitchen walls, for easy reference, and to pass down to future generations. Each season a challenge. The year-round preservation calendar, one of the clearest proofs of the organization of the medieval kitchen, is how they worked seasonally, not randomly, but rather a food preservation schedule established cyclically throughout the year. Spring kicked off the salting and smoking campaign to clear out any remaining food from the previous winter before it spoiled. Early summer was for processing herbs, drying them into bundles hung from the roof. This was when the kitchens operated at a lighter pace. Preparing for the midsummer vegetable influx. Midsummer was the peak vegetable season. Records from one castle show they processed over 2,000 pounds of vegetables in just 1 week in August. Autumn was the preservation campaign season. The kitchens became full-capacity factories, with salting, smoking, and pickling all happening simultaneously. Some castles even held preservation festivals where all castle staff participated, though records show these festivals involved as much beer drinking as meat salting. One cook once recorded that he accidentally salted a whole bunch of keys after a very lively party. Winter was the rationing phase. The master cook had to precisely calculate weekly portions. Overspending in December would lead to starvation in March. Winter was divided into 3 stages. Early winter still used freshly preserved food. Midwinter began using the most durable items. Late winter involved getting creative with whatever was left. Weather forecasting also became a crucial skill. Kitchen staff recorded cloud formations, animal behavior, and even whether rats were hoarding food early to predict how harsh the coming winter would be. One cook wrote that if the rats started eating more before the first frost, prepare for a harsh winter. Freezing cold went up. Everything turned upside down. The siege and lessons in improvisation. But no matter how carefully planned, there were times when things went beyond control. A prime example was the siege of the castle in 1226, where the food preservation system was tested to its limits. The castle held out for over 3 months, largely thanks to its food reserves. It wasn't just about having enough food, but keeping it edible. When the main cellar flooded, the entire kitchen staff had to move tons of food to higher ground in just one night. One unlucky cook was locked in a storeroom for 6 hours. In the rush after the incident, they implemented improvisational innovations, moving grains into sealed earthenware jars to deter rats, using vinegar to wipe cheese daily to prevent mold, and rotating cheese to ensure even drying. Quality control also. They've reached a new level. Food tasters not only checked for poison but also for spoilage. They used all their senses, listening to the sound of tapping on salt barrels. Each sound had a different meaning. Feeling smoked meat. If it was too soft, there was a problem. Looking at the color of pickled vegetables, as one note clearly stated, if salted eggs turn green, give them to the enemy. Despite losing about 20% of food to spoilage each year, considering the conditions of the time, that was an impressive rate. And when all measures failed, they still had a plan B. Sprouting grains right on the windowsill, quickly smoking fresh meat, using spoiled wine to make vinegar. The legacy of preservation. These techniques live on. Looking back, what's astonishing is not just these methods effective, but they are still used to this. Day 4. The distinctive smoky flavor in smoked meat, a legacy from the castle smokehouse. Handmade pickled jars at farmers' markets, with recipes not much different from the Middle Ages. The trick to keeping vegetables crisp with grape leaves dates back to the time of the pickle master, who meticulously recorded each batch, even the way our ancestors preserved food before refrigerators. It could also be a continuation of ancient knowledge accumulated over centuries. One thing is certain, even without electricity, without refrigerators, without humidity meters, medieval people still managed to preserve food and maintain their way of life, not just to survive, but also to create flavors that we still seek out to this day.